to Collapse Astrology. Today's video is actually going to be mostly audio from an episode of the Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spagnola, which I was honored to be a guest on last month. Carmen and I talked about the mundane astrology of the next few years, in particular Neptune's movement from Pisces into Aries and how it relates to the climate crisis. Now, even though this is collapse astrology, I don't really feel like I am fully out of the closet with the collapse piece, but I guess for whoever listens to this episode all the way through, I will be. Carmen is my main teacher in the realm of collapse awareness. She has incredible frameworks and knowledge and tons of practical advice and experience, all related to grappling with the fact that we are in a long-term process of societal collapse. She's someone who makes me feel sane because she's not an astrologer, but she's very psychic and intuitive, as well as just extremely knowledgeable. And she sees from her own vantage point what I see in the astrology, which is that collapse is here, especially for the West, and that we're really better off facing it and talking about it and planning for it than trying to ignore it and stay in our privileged delusions as long as possible. So this conversation focuses on climate collapse in particular. And if that is completely unfamiliar territory to you, or if it's too familiar, if it's too close to home for whatever reason, you might actually just want to skip this video. You'll hear Carmen give some advice in her intro as well, how she recommends to tend to your nervous system while venturing into these territories of the future that can be pretty scary or despair-inducing. And Carmen actually recommends movement, being active in some way while you listen, so you might want to find this episode on a podcast app and listen to it there instead. In general, just trust your gut and only take in as much of this conversation as you feel like you can digest. And since this was one of the first podcasts I've ever been on, I was kind of nervous, and listening back, there are a few things that I missed or just things I wish I'd articulated more clearly. So I also recorded an addendum that I will add here at the end of the podcast episode. And if you keep listening, you'll also hear Carmen's addendum, which is a lot more information on what ends up being one of the main subjects of the conversation, the AMOC. And if you don't know what the AMOC is, well, there might be a reason why you're here at this moment, because it's an important thing to know if you want to be in reality. So without further ado, here is the episode.
The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spagnola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. Broadcasting since 2014. I'm your host, Carmen Spagnola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, recently known as Victoria, BC, Canada. Welcome to my Witches New Year podcast retreat mini-series. This is a special episode for all my collapse nerds who are tracking the converging emergencies of large-scale cooperation dilemmas. If you are not a collapse nerd, may I suggest to you that you skip this episode. If you are here for the sacred pause and the gentle time out, that's not the part of the retreat that we're in. So those of us who want to get granular, kind of grindy, this is for you, right? So if you are curious about what the stars and planets have to tell us about how these patterns of collapse, these patterns of large-scale emergencies converging together have unfolded in the past, and then how we can navigate them more successfully perhaps in the near and midterm future, this episode is for you. Welcome. My guest today is Hummingbird Star from Astrology for the Revolution. They are a self-described collapse astrologer, and soon we'll better understand what that means. Hummingbird is here to expand our thoughts on 2025 as the year of the Hermit, and also give us some insight into what we can expect from the planets, particularly outer planet movements that might support this impulse to turn inwards and do some soul searching about our role in the revolution. There are many other inner planet transits that'll be really important and impactful in 2025, but I think you'll be able to find a lot of that material coming very shortly from all the popular astrologers. All the kids are going to get in on that game. So we don't need to cover that. This is for something kind of adjacent, right? So, but first, I still have a content note before we begin. We are talking about climate change. And so honestly, if you're having a really nice day and you want to keep it that way, I mean it when I say just skip. If you're okay to stay with us, I still highly recommend you do some tasking while you listen. You want to keep your arms and legs on. You want to give yourself permission to just pay partial attention so that you don't get overwhelmed. This is kind of like controlled dissociation, okay? Just like listen and take in the Goldilocks amount, right? And take lots of breaks and, listen maybe while you are going for a walk and walking the dog. But you don't want to just like immerse yourself totally in this material. Maybe unless you have someone else you're listening with and then you can jam on it. But it's probably too much to just digest on your own. In other words, don't listen while you're like at the computer or scrolling your phone or whatever. Really, somatically, you want to be tasking or moving, doing the dishes, folding the laundry, gardening, that kind of thing. And then specifically, we're talking about the potential shutdown of the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. I didn't realize this was going to come up. We kind of dance around it for a little bit. I wasn't sure I wanted to like overwhelm folks with it. But then it was just so relevant. So we went there. But as I was just speaking kind of off the cuff, and I misspoke in a way that misrepresents how the AMOC actually functions. And we should be aiming for precision, right? And I'm definitely oversimplifying when I'm making kind of general claims about how the AMOC shutdown could impact weather and agricultural patterns. I also think I'm tracking multiple different sites of climate emergency at once in my mind. And sometimes I end up just collapsing them all down into converging emergencies. And that collapsing can really induce panic in people. And I guess it's just like the water in which I swim and conversation that I'm having with my husband all the time. So it doesn't make me feel panicked, but I understand it could. And Hummingbird is going to talk about immanentizing the eschaton. And we will try not to do that. We'll explain what that is in a bit. Anyway, so yeah, when I'm like oversimplifying with claims about how the AMOC shutdown could impact weather and agricultural patterns, I do think that given the extremely high cost of ignoring this event, which would dramatically alter life on Earth for billions of people, I do think it's okay to have a bit of like alarm, right? But there's a danger that like my haphazard comments could spread as misinformation, and I really don't want that. I really want you to have correct information. So A, you don't sound uninformed, but B, you don't get into a situation where like you or someone else is just dismissing what I'm saying because I made an error when I was explaining it. So I want to be very clear about the AMOC. And so here's a really nice, succinct, digestible explanation of what the AMOC is and a nice, succinct, and conservative interpretation of what the shutdown would do. And it happens to come from the Guardian, a Guardian article that was published on October 23rd, 2024. It actually was published after the interview with Hummingbird. There are many others, but I thought I might as well use this one that is like absolutely as current as possible. So here's the direct quote from the Guardian. AMOC, or the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, is a system of ocean currents that brings heat into the northern Atlantic. Warm surface water from the tropics flows north and releases its heat in the subpolar Arctic, south of Greenland and west of Britain and Ireland. Then it cools and sinks to a depth of between 2,000 to 3,000 meters before returning south as a cold current. AMOC is one of our planet's largest heat transport systems, moving the equivalent of 50 times the human energy use, and it has a particularly strong impact on the climate in Europe. And it affects the ocean's CO2 uptake and oxygen supply, as well as rainfall patterns in the tropics. Okay, so end of that quote. This is what I was trying to get at, but that is very clear. And now the conservative part. So, new quote, still from The Guardian. The effects of a shutdown include a cooling of the northern hemisphere, particularly northwest Europe. There would also be a shift of the tropical rainfall belt to the south, which is bad because the rains will move away from the rainforest to regions that are not used to so much rainfall. So this will mean droughts in some regions and floods in others. AMOC collapse would have a major impact on the northern Atlantic sea level, which would rise by 0.5 meter or so, in addition to the rise caused by global heating. It would also reduce the CO2 uptake of the ocean because AMOC sinking in the northern Atlantic takes a lot of CO2 down into the deep oceans where it's safely locked away from the atmosphere. So when it stops doing that, where does that CO2 go? Okay, continuing. AMOC collapse would also change the nutrient supply and reduce the oxygen of the deep oceans. This would have a massive effect on marine biology and the entire ecosystem of the northern Atlantic. Okay, end quote. I say that's conservative because it sounds like, ooh, gee, that sounds bad. You have to really sink in and play out those ideas to have it really hit you. What would that mean though? It's intense. So we referenced Sharon Astic in this episode, excellent researcher and author. After this interview, in the outro, I'm going to say a wee bit more about the likelihood of an AMOC shutdown in the next couple days. And this is all taken from Sharon Astic's synthesis. And then about how we might think about navigating this particular climate challenge in our households and communities, in addition to the other climate challenges. But for now, I just wanted to give you that information. And at this point, though, let's turn it over to Hummingbird to give us a sense of what to expect astrologically in 2025, our year of the Hermit. So, Hummingbird, what identities do you lead with?
I am an American white Jewish woman. I think that American is an important identity to claim, not because I am proud to be an American, but I think it's just kind of a unique, karmic identity. And I'm an astrologer and a somatics facilitator. And I also identify as a cat lady. I think that is both of my gender and relational orientation.
Nice. So what is your definition of collapse astrology? And relatedly, why is your, I guess it's your Instagram handle, maybe it's YouTube, but your brand is Astrology for the Revolution.
So yeah, your question made me think about my kind of evolution of thought there, because it started out as activist astro when I first started the project in 2018. And it became Astrology for the Revolution, and I kind of started collapse astrology as a separate thing, but I kind of feel like everything is going to collapse into collapse astrology pretty soon. So it originally started as politicized astrology, astrology with a politic, astrology that's not trying to be neutral, not trying to be quote unquote objective, astrology I wanted to lean into how we can use the practice of astrology as a tool for liberation. And I do feel like it's interesting the way that the names have evolved, because I do feel like I have become, less hopeful, especially about any kind of political revolution happening, and just as I have discovered the frameworks of collapse awareness, and that really speaks to more of what I have been working with and seeing in the astrology, than activism or revolution. So yeah, I also think now, especially with the collapse theme, it's a lot more about how do we use astrology as a map to kind of anticipate what's coming, and how can we use it as a framework for understanding this moment in time when so many of the narratives that we have been programmed with, that we have, relied on as far as just like, what do I believe? What is life about? What am I doing with my life? So many of those things are collapsing. Astrology, while it's definitely not, objective, it does give you something to lean into. That's some certainty that I think the brain and the nervous system kind of crave and can kind of relax with a little bit. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot of unexplored potential really for astrology and helping people that are really wanting to move things forward in society, whatever that means.
That's so relatable, that idea of like, and then it evolved and here we are at collapse. Like I work with a lot of parents and have always worked with a lot of parents, or like individuals who are actually, I should say, becoming parents or have become parents and then become aware of collapse, or they're experiencing a lot of ecological grief or like climate anxiety, and it's like, should I have children? And the way that I have supported them in terms of like, yeah, providing some education about collapse and, what I think is important. I still think that like developing an ability to self and co-regulate, I do think that's like the primary goal as a parent, is like for yourself and for your child. And then for a while I was talking a lot more about what are the developmental tasks that you need to go through so that you can be stable and reorient yourself when your child is having very serious mental health issues because of the inevitable climate collapse and all of that. So it's like, so basically, oh, you're considering becoming a parent, so you will be a mental health professional. And so you should be taking all of the, courses and education and informally and formally, and reading all the books, because parenting isn't about like getting them to do what you want to do. It's about dealing with their anxieties. And now I'm kind of more in the like, okay, you want to be a parent. How do you feel about being so against the grain with how you raise your child that you are raising a child in the way that you would want to restructure society? So it's like, the whole thing isn't get your child through school and get them to college or university. It's like, what is education for? How am I going to educate them? So that evolution of like, I started with being collapse aware or climate aware and was like, okay, here's the skills we need. And it kind of ultimately ends up at, how do you want to be in what's the world you want to create? What's the role you want to play in this restructuring? And what are you willing to do in terms of how you're going to live differently and kind of, against the grain, kind of a little further upstream than other people, tip of the spear. Like, you have to develop some real resilience for that, because although there's many, many more people speaking about collapse these days, we're still pretty niche, I would say, right? So in terms of how you approach this as an astrologer, like, what are your thoughts? What's your process on predictive astrology around collapse, especially when it comes to predicting like kind of scary, dysregulating, destabilizing things?
Yeah, so this is something I have thought about so much over the past many years, because I have been talking about the coming astrology since about 2018, and I didn't have collapse frameworks when I first started talking about it. And I did a lot of immanentizing the eschaton, which is a phrase I learned from John Michael Greer on the Numinous Podcast a long time ago. Immanentizing the eschaton, it's when you believe that doomsday is going to be here tomorrow.
Yeah. No, collapse is a long, slow process. And so we're not doomsdaying as though the sky is falling and it's happening on a certain date, and which is imminent, and it's all that's not what it is. It's the long, slow demise of infrastructure and the deindustrialization of our economies. That's like basically what it is. Okay, so you used to do that.
And it was food for my soul when I came across frameworks that spoke to it more like that. Because I think, with astrology and with predictive astrology, the temptation to do that, or the tendency to immanentize the eschaton, can be super strong, super easy to fall into. If you know enough about astrology to look towards the future and see how this and this planet are coming together at this and this time, it's easy to have a story, especially if you are collapse aware or are enough aware of what's happening politically and climate wise. It's very easy to look at something and be like, oh, this is just when it's all going to end, or it's all going to dramatically change. So it has been healing for me over time to learn not to do that. But in that process, I have thought a lot about how to speak to these subjects, and I've had some experience sharing this information with clients or in a course setting, and inducing a freeze response, basically. And so I don't know, if that's completely unavoidable. In general, with collapse conversation, it's not completely unavoidable, but there's a couple just pieces that I think can be helpful. One thing I like to say is that it's not about prediction, it's about anticipation. So when you're looking towards the future with astrology, it's not about saying, this specific thing is going to happen at this specific time. It's about anticipating what are the energies that we're moving into. And then along those lines too, I think it can be really helpful to think of astrology as kind of like a multidimensional map of the road ahead. So there is, linear time, there's time frames of, when something is happening. And so we can see in terms of time, like when there may be something more challenging, when there may be a respite, when there may be a fast turn, something may change quickly. And then the energies, the planets involved, the signs involved also gives information kind of about like the weather, like what are the energies going to be like in these different time frames. So having a map is not the same as going on the journey. The map is not the territory. Astrology does not have the answers. This is what I at least like to tell myself, because it was helpful for me when I recognized it, that like astrology does not have the answers to how we actually navigate the territory of collapse. And I also definitely don't have those answers, not my expertise at all, really. But still, it's better to have a map than not, right? It's better to have something that you can look towards and have some sense of anticipation of what's coming. So as we get into some of the coming specifics in the astrology, hopefully that can be helpful for listeners. Nothing is about saying that this is set in stone. And a lot of it is going to be about how you are navigating things just personally, how you're moving through these energies personally. So it can be useful to know if there's a lot of fire or a lot of earth or different pieces like that.
Yeah, I want to amplify that because that's such a brilliant thing to say, that astrology doesn't have the answers. It's just telling you, here's what this terrain kind of looks like on a map. But again, you're going to get there and be like, oh, it's a lot boggier here than it showed, or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I totally agree that when we talk about collapse, it's like we have invoked the muse. Welcome trauma, like welcome fear, welcome all these things. And so there isn't a way to talk about collapse that is going to be like, velvet on your nervous system. There just isn't. And, we have the Collapse 101 course in the Numinous Network, and the network itself is set up, and the calls, everything that we do is for sensitive nervous systems. But even still, there are people that I'm like, I don't think you should take that course, because if you know yourself to be a real ruminator, then, you want to be listening lightly. What I often tell people, and I want listeners to really heed this is a better episode if you're tasking. Like you're in the garden, you're
moving your body,
doing dishes. Yeah, you're doing laundry, rather than when you're in the car driving. Please don't, because you're just going to get tense without knowing it. If you want to really listen closely because you feel pretty resilient and you love prepping, even still, I would say while you're going for a walk so that your arms and legs are moving. This just isn't a great episode for when you're sitting down and not doing much, like at your computer. Anything you can do to like keep your arms and legs on a little bit, because even when you love this stuff and you want to keep going, both of us having a little stretch here, even when you love it, you can't talk about collapse without it kind of getting a bit of an oppressive feeling in your nervous system. So you just want to keep a little movement. Okay, so with 2025 being a Hermit card year, and folks who listened to the last episode, that's like a numerological, I would call it part of a magical practice, divinatory practice. 2025 is going to be our Hermit card year because it's the card that's associated with, perimenopause brain number 9. Is that where I'm at? Yes. Okay. Very basic math. 2 + 2 + 5. So given the Hermit card themes we talked about in the last episode, what are some of the things you would encourage people to make space for in their lives next year? And I'm also curious, like, which particular transits look particularly hermity to you?
I love that the Hermit is the card for 2025, because I feel like the Hermit is a very liminal card and 2025 is a very liminal year. The transit that I want to just mostly zero in on for this whole conversation is Neptune's movement from Pisces into Aries. And I'll get more into the specifics about that later. But in terms of 2025 being a liminal year, what is happening kind of in the big picture astrologically is that both Neptune and Pisces or both Neptune and Saturn are moving from Pisces into Aries. And they both move into the very, very beginning of Aries, and then they both move back into Pisces. And there are a lot of themes with Neptune and Pisces, especially to do with delusion. And for listeners of this podcast who have felt as if they are existing in a bubble of reality when everybody else is not in reality. And, if you're a collapsible person, if you're lucky, you have people around you who speak your language. But for most people, if you have to, go to work or be in an educational situation or extended family situation or whatever it is where you're interacting with quote unquote normies, you might really feel like the odd one out. And we were talking about this just a little before getting started. It's a very weird time right now, and I think the astrology really describes it. There are some of us that are just very aware that there is a major emergency happening, and then there are a lot of people that are just completely head in the sand, whether that's celebrity culture or sports or even the political horse race or whatever else it is. There's a million opportunities to be distracted right now. And I do believe that Neptune's movement from Pisces into Aries is going to manifest as the popping of that delusional bubble. But 2025 is going to be strange, going to be kind of liminal, because there might be a little bit of like a seeming wake up in the middle of the year. And by the end of the year, it probably will feel as if the world is putting its head back under the sand, or, the water is back above everybody's head again. And so there were a couple pieces about the Hermit card that you named that I think are really relevant here. So one of the pieces that you mentioned was about the Hermit being somebody who steps off of the pedestal, who isn't looking for recognition, who is kind of in the dark, seeing in the dark, like very shamanic, but hidden away, right? And I think that that's a pretty good recommendation of an approach for a collapse aware person who is maybe super hungry for more people to be recognizing the truth. You may get like a taste of that in 2025, but then, like I said, that may kind of go away again. So I think, to really identify with the hermit and identify as that one who is kind of keeping the vigil in the dark, doing the work in the dark, alone and isolated in a way.
So are you saying like, don't be surprised if like you get like a little bit of the, what would that be, like a dopamine hit, like a little bit of the like, people get me, but then it's like, wait, what? Like it's kind of short-lived.
Yeah. And maybe on the personal level, that could happen, I think, in a lot of different ways for people, not only related to collapse, but I think in terms of a wake-up call around the climate crisis in particular. I'll say more about the specifics of the archetypes later, but like I think specifically around that, there could be a time when it seems like people are addressing the emergency, and then that might sink back down. And not that every collapse aware person is like desperate for recognition, but I talk to a lot of clients who feel like it's very up in the air for them, like what their role is in this time. And they feel like they know they're here for a purpose. And they're like, oh, I have this job, it pays the bills, it's not bad, but I'm not really sure like how I'm supposed to show up and how I'm supposed to lead or what I'm supposed to offer. But I feel like there's something. And I think that we are reaching a time when there is going to be more like yearning for the wisdom that people who have been studying collapse and kind of facing these shadows for a while have to offer. And it's probably is a very like soul fulfilling thing, for people to be able to offer that, even if it's just very locally, even if it's just, in an inner circle or with family or whatever. And then it could be just a little bit like disappointing to see that go away. But the full wake up call, I think, will be more in 2026. So I just think that the hermit, has good advice for taking this year to be liminal and not needing to know the longer term picture, maybe for yourself in a lot of ways.
Right. It's not really a year for like fruition. It's like an
in
between kind of place. So
not a year for fruition.
Good. We can be patient then. We can like call on the patience of the hermit. And this is good data to have so we can manage our energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's one other piece I wanted to say about mentorship, because you mentioned that being a theme of the hermit. And you mentioned, I think, that the hermit is a different kind of a mentor than the Hierophant. And I loved that because I had never really thought of the hermit as a mentor figure, but I had thought of how Chiron and Saturn are both mentor figures in astrology. And Saturn is much more similar to the Hierophant. And I actually feel like Chiron has a lot in common with the hermit. And Saturn is entering Aries next year. Chiron is in Aries and has been for a while. And so I thought that theme is really relevant, maybe more in terms of Chiron's type of mentorship and guidance. So Chiron, kind of like the hermit, he is an outcast. He's half horse, half human. He can never be fully human. He lives in a cave on the outskirts of society. He's also very shamanic, and he's a mentor to a lot of figures in astrology. But even as a mentor, he can never be fully part of the human society. And that's a part of like the real wound in the archetype of Chiron. And so it really made me think 2025, being this liminal year, being a hermit year, really made me think about, maybe an invitation to learn from the wounded of our world. So I always think of people with chronic illness and disabilities and sensitive nervous systems when I think of Chiron. anyone whose brain just works a little bit differently, that doesn't always fit into kind of mainstream ways of being, of socializing. Of course, there's just, so much wisdom and all the life experiences that people have had who experience being outcast in one way or another. And so I feel like there are a lot of different ways we can take on that type of like mentorship and learning and offer, maybe offering our wisdom from our own wounded and vulnerable places, not needing to take on the Saturnian or Hierophant type of, authority figure who's like, do this, do not do that. Mm-hmm. With Saturn and Aries, there also could be some of those experiences, whether or not it's coming from an authority figure, just more need for discipline and structures and boundaries. But yeah, the Hermit made me think of Chiron a lot.
It's an interesting idea to have this just keep in the collective consciousness here, though, about teachers and teaching. So all of these figures are making choices about, again, like, how do we want to be? Like, what's the valence here? And so I would say 2025, like thinking about who do you want to be your teachers, and perhaps more lived experience teachers, or, teachers that are not necessarily the easiest to find, so they come to you through referral, through word of mouth, through, that sort of thing. And then also as a teacher that, you can be getting really great feedback, but you don't get the social conventions or the social trappings of like huge platform or big likes or massive programs or whatever it is. And like, that's okay. It's not that your work isn't gaining traction. I often feel that way, where it's like, I don't know, I feel like there's some expectation. Maybe it's in my own mind, or maybe it's in earlier interpretations I had of my chart, where like I have this expectation, like, oh, it's going to be impactful somehow. And so then when I'm not getting the sort of socially sanctioned feedback of like huge likes, huge platform, great wealth, it's like, oh, it's just not happening for me. But that's not true, because the feedback from the people I work with is like, oh, this is the real deal. This is so much better. This is so much more value. I'm still learning so much from you. It's been 4 years, that kind of thing. So I feel like I have a lot of Hermit energy. So thinking of like, oh, great, a whole year to devote to something that I feel like I know so well. Like, how am I going to do this? But I think there's a lot of integrity in this card, and integrity is such an important value for me. And so it's nice to think about, what is the leadership that's integrity with my values? Like, first of all, we have to be really clear on what our values are. And a person who values integrity would have done a like deep dive in excavation. So if that piece of integrity in leadership or in teaching, or being in integrity with your values as a teacher, especially if you're like an anti-capitalist, the Hermit is a really great card to sort of transition your approach. I think transition away from teachers who are not talking about these things, or who do not have lived experience, or, it's not sitting right with you. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. What else do you see as like really hermity in the short term in 2025?
I see some stuff that's not really hermity.
Oh, really? Like what? Tell us. We want that too.
I mean, there are other big outer planet transitions happening. Uranus is moving into Gemini. That's another one where it kind of moves in and then comes back at the end of the year. I feel like that's a pretty, I don't know, kind of explosive energy. Yeah, I think there's mostly just more that I can say about Saturn and Neptune, because I really only like dipped in there. And that's the main thing like that I think is going to be just very palpable during the year.
Okay. Can you say more? Like, not that you have to give us like a month by month breakdown, but what do you think about this Saturn Neptune situation?
So this is my overall take. Neptune has been in Pisces since 2010, and I think there are a lot of, different things that transit tracks to, but I think the main one is the climate crisis and the rising oceans and the rising temperatures and humanity's, or especially the West's, delusion around that. And so both Neptune and Pisces are archetypes that are associated with the ocean. And they're also both associated, like I mentioned earlier, with delusion and confusion and not being able to see clearly, not being able to see in front of you, like haze and fog. They're also both associated with escapism and addictive behaviors. And I think a huge piece of that is social media. There are lots of other elements to it too, but when you mentioned like not getting the likes, not getting the recognition on social media that we're all just have been so quickly programmed to think as like of the pinnacle of success.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that so much of human consciousness is fully like caught in that ocean of content and all of the other, things that are there to confuse us also. And I think that when Neptune fully leaves Pisces, so we're looking at all that stuff while the oceans are rising, while the temperatures are rising. Just in the past couple of years, it's gotten to another level of kind of extremeness where people are naming it in a way they weren't even a couple of years ago. But there's still not real action on any global, collective level at all. And I forget if you've ever talked about the AMOC on your podcast.
I'll say a little about it. Okay, let's tread carefully with it because
let's save that for a little later.
Yeah, we'll save it, and also we'll like not freak people out.
Yeah,
it was freaky, but as you're speaking, I'm like, I want to know, when do you think anyway. Okay, sorry to all the listeners who are like this. I'm listening to an inside conversation and people won't tell me the secret. It's just climate stuff, which, as Hummingbird is saying, like, it's climate stuff. It's all been talked about since, what was Al Gore's movie? Since Inconvenient Truth, right? Like, we've known about it in that same kind of way. And there's like a big wave about it, and then that wave will subside and be creating tsunamis elsewhere, so it is nothing new, but we are going to get more granular. So everyone, feel your seat, feel your feet. We're going to get there. Okay. Sorry. Carry on.
So I think the summary there, though, is that for a long time, I have seen this Neptune transit into Aries as being the time when this bubble is going to burst, and it's going to be no longer possible to be completely in the collective delusion that so much of the West has been in regarding the climate crisis in particular. Saturn is the planet that is known for making things real, for bringing things into form. So you have Neptune, an outer planet that represents this very vast collective energy. And then Saturn is going to come into contact with it right at the very beginning of Aries, like 0 degrees of Aries, which is the first degree of the zodiac. Like, that's just pretty wild, potent energy on its own. And for Saturn and Neptune to be meeting there at this time really says to me that that is when the big wake-up call is coming. Saturn is going to make it much more obvious what Neptune has been doing in Pisces all these years. And just to be clear, this, for example, is kind of a prediction, but this is not any different from what experts are saying. right?
That's right.
This is just the astrology aligning with what experts in these subjects have been saying for years and are saying with louder voices now than ever.
Totally. It's as was foretold by all the science climatologists, all the scientific community, basically. So yes, as was foretold in the Great Prophecy by the IPCC or whatever. IPCC.
Yes.
Yeah.
A few different times, I think.
Yep. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Where do you want to take us next, Hummingbird? Because now I'm just thinking about the AMOC.
I mean, we're right there. Should we go there?
Do it. Let's do it.
Okay. So the AMOC is the Atlantic Meridional overturning system, meridional, something like that. Overturning current
circulation.
And overturning circulation.
Let's do it again.
Anyway, AMOC.
Yeah. I'm not like such a stickler for this. You and I know what the AMOC is, but just in case people want to Google it, it's the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And I also just had to grab my phone and Google it because I always just want to call it the mid-ocean current. Because that's what it is. Right. Basically what it is. It's going to turn over. But no, it's the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. Okay. So it's okay, I'm going to say this. Everyone, we're holding hands right now. When the currents of the ocean go backwards, bad things happen in massive scales that particularly will impact our ability to grow food, to have proper seasons. And it's concentrated in particular areas of the world that are highly, highly populated and also do a lot of food production for the world. That's kind of how I explain it to people. How would you explain it to people, Hummingbird?
So the AMOC is a complex set of currents in the Atlantic Ocean, both the northern and southern hemispheres that interact with each other. And it's based on salinity, which affects the temperature of water and the different depths that the currents are happening at. So it's a very complex combination of currents that basically all together form the jet stream, I think. They basically are what create the weather patterns that we currently have in the Western Hemisphere. And there has been evidence coming out, kind of dripping out for a while, but then getting a lot more intense in the past couple of years and a lot more kind of immediate evidence that the AMOC is shutting down. So I don't know for sure if it's like turning around or going backwards. The sense that I get is that it's just there's a lot more cold, fresh water coming in to the ocean as the ice caps are melting. And that is just kind of shutting down, like slowing down, and then just starting to shut down the circulation of these currents. So the earliest studies about it said it looks like it possibly could shut down if we don't reverse global warming by the end of the century. But the more recent studies about it are saying like it is shutting down. Like there are lots of signs that it is shutting down, and it's not something you can just fix things and snap your fingers and it's going to turn back on. It is shutting down. It has shut down in history before, not super long ago, about 12,000 years ago. And I don't I think this is a place where it is easy to immunize the eschaton and
because the evidence comes first before we can see with our eyes. We can see with we experience it before it gets studied. And so it's like, oh, is the AMOC shutting down? Look. Just look. So it's not going to be that helpful for them to keep predicting it's 50 years away, it's 30 years away, it's 20 years away when entire cities are getting washed out and it's the worst hurricane season ever. It's kind of like how much more prediction is going to be helpful for you when you are literally underwater. So it is, when people talk about the AMOC, they're talking about the things you can see on the news right now that are not anomalous anymore. And we're trying to say here on this podcast and many other areas, and scientists are trying to say, this is going to be so much more commonplace, so much sooner than we expected. And it's one of the signs that, like, I don't want to say that it's too late because I know that freaks people out, but let's be honest. Like, it's one of the signs that this is a runaway kind of situation where even when we wake up, we would be waking up to some devastation. And so the preparation that we need to do is not ignore this and really think carefully about, okay, how livable in this context is the place where I live? How skillful am I at growing food? How dependent am I on supply chains of very specific kinds of food because of my health situation? Like, these are just things that we'll need to know, because if you are reliant on those things, then that creates another cascade of decisions. Like, what am I going to do for money? Should I actually move in with other people so I can start saving money now? Like, it really is, as you say, it does immanentize things, because you won't have enough money to survive in the way that we used to as like nuclear families and single family houses and that kind of stuff. So I can definitely see the Hermit year being a good time to like really think about what things do I just need to let go of? What am I ready to release? What are the trappings of the old world that are actually just weighing me down and making it difficult for me to be responsive and participatory in the new kind of culture that I want to have? Just bringing it down to something more personal, it's like, okay, anticipating all of this, it was very clear to me that it's like, you know what, my life in the city and with the amenities that I love and all the people that I love, I don't want to be a flight from the city kind of person, but we can't afford to live here anymore. And I have never wanted to leave my home and leave this ecosystem to go to my husband's family's land, because it's like a wildfire zone. It's in the desert. But the thing is, it's paid for, and that's what we can afford. And so, really thinking carefully about like, which dreams do I need to just let go? Turns out I'm not going to live in a cute little house with a porch with a beautiful green pasture and horses out front. Turns out I'm going to be living in high alpine desert, because that is what is available. And so this is the kind of like thinking really hard about how then are we going to survive there if we have to grow our own food, if we have to, and get more skillful at that. So I say all of this because I know that it can freak people out, and they're like, but I can't do anything. And it's like, actually, you can, but you have to get so very real with yourself, and you have to let go of some like dreams of capitalism, and it will take you years to do that. So like, please take 2025 as the year that you actually have like a year of lament, a year of goodbye, a year of transition, and just say like, ooh, I'm going into my cave. But when I emerge, it's because I actually am going to be mobilized, because I have to be responsive to the energies that are coming. And like, please take us to 2026, because, that's going to be a Wheel of Fortune year. And I'm really looking forward to that. Anyway, sorry, carry on. Carry on.
Okay, I want to clarify a tiny bit about the AMOC, because from what I understand, so first of all, it's two different situations: global warming and the rising oceans, rising temperatures around the globe because of trapped fossil fuels. That is causing the shutdown of the AMOC, but that's a different kind of climate impact. The AMOC shutting down, from what I've seen, the likely like climate changes are in Western Europe and like northeastern Turtle Island maybe will be most directly impacted, and temperatures there will get colder. And I don't think so, way colder as in like ice age colder, because there is like different information about this out there too. From what I've seen, it was like a few degrees, and it definitely like would affect what crops can be grown and the growing season and that kind of thing. I don't think, it necessarily is to the extent where like nobody could live there.
No, it's
But I
not
could be
that nobody
wrong.
could live there. No, for sure. It's not that nobody could live there, but it is going to impact, like you say, the ability to grow certain things. And it also then the knock-on effect of that is it puts so much more pressure on the areas that can grow. And so,
Right.
and then also the places that we normally would supplement with Ukraine, like different parts of Europe, they will actually not be able to grow. So
Right.
the other knock-on effect is that you could still live there, but you can't afford to heat there. And then the other kind of things that people do to heat, which is right now it's fossil fuels, right? So
Right.
the 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 very populated, this is the global north is going to find such heating pressure and food pressure that becomes extremely volatile. And then there are places like India, for instance, which is like the breadbasket for so much of Southeast Asia. Their monsoon seasons are going to be so different. And so it's really, when I'm looking at these impacts, and we should just say, like, a person that I follow quite a bit on this is Sharon Astick, and I'll link to her in the show notes. But when I'm looking at that and following kind of the pieces of evidence that we see is crop failures, wars over fuels for heating, climate displacement, and immigration, and all of that. It's like these are I guess the other thing too we should say is that it's in places that would kind of normally shock people, like northeast of the US and Europe. And so we're kind of used to, in like settler colonial culture, we're used to bad things happening to the global south, and we just kind of go, wow, that's so tragic, and we carry on. It's not going to be like that anymore. It's like global north, and that's going to create quite a lot of social disruption. And so the whole thing of like, why are these wars so protracted? Why are these, land grabs becoming more and more contentious? Like, why is settler colonialism like raising its ugly head again in places? It's because of food and fuel, because of the changes.
I mean, this is already happening.
Yeah.
Without, like, I really don't think the people making those calls even know about the AMOC, or maybe they do, like, as of this year. But that piece especially has been super buried, or just hasn't come to the surface with all the rest of the climate conversations until really recently. But I mean, those kind of policies are definitely already in place, and there definitely are people who have been thinking about global warming, even if they weren't thinking about the AMOC, who are making those kind of calls.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Sorry, I interrupted, but I think it's good for us to just kind of be like, hey, there's this thing, the AMOC, and experts are unclear as to how imminent it is, but we can look around and we can see some things that there's no single event that's going to be diagnostic, but clusters are indicative. And there are clusters of events that would have us say, we think that the current is shutting down, and we think that we can already see what some of the impacts of that might be in some of the contentious areas of the world, and the cost of heating and those kinds of things.
Yes. And this is where astrology, brings an interesting extra layer into the picture. And this is really true with Pluto's movement into Aquarius and geopolitics also. There are these transitions happening that outside of astrology, you can't really diagnose. Like you said, you can't really name the exact timing that this is happening. But when I see Neptune moving from Pisces into Aries, I'm like, oh, it's pretty obvious it's happening right now. Like, all the science says, like, it could be happening right now. And then Neptune is moving into Aries. Like, it's happening right now. Mm-hmm. So I want to clarify too about the AMOC. Like, the predictions have been, the shutdown will start in between, 2025 to 2075 or something. And then it has become more and more clear recently that the shutdown is starting. And so what I think is that Neptune's transition into Aries will correspond to real public acknowledgement that is happening. Not that it's something that might happen in the future if we don't turn things around, that it is happening and there's no going back from it. But even that is not like the climate is going to change overnight. Mm-hmm. And a lot of things that you were saying are like things that I had written in my notes for like later in this conversation, but just about how we are powerless in a lot of ways in terms of these bigger picture shifts, but we're also right here, like in the present right now. And even in the next like 2 years, like there may be this big reveal and more of a sense of emergency, but also like we won't be fully underwater. Like,
right. So, okay. So as we look ahead a bit in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot tradition, we would expect then, just looking at the cards as well. So we have astrology sort of giving us hints. We have cards giving us hints in Rider-Waite. When we look at like some of the upcoming cards, there's some of the most turbulent ones in the tarot, like the Death card would be coming in the next few years, the Tower on the not too distant horizon. So yeah, when I'm looking ahead at the next sort of 10 cards, the next line of the major arcana, I'm like, oh man, like we really hope that you have learned the lessons of the cards up to now, because that like cumulative benefit is what you need to be able to get through the next piece. So if you're looking ahead from a collapse perspective, what are some of the major transits you're watching in like the medium term that could really shake things up globally?
So I want to talk about the present / early past just for a minute, because I want to talk about Pluto moving into Aquarius, which is a transit that started last year and is complete on November 19th of this year. And I just posted a video and an article on Medium about this, so I won't go too much into depth, and people can check there if they want more information. But that transition, I think, speaks to the geopolitical changes that are happening right now, where the United States is losing its legitimacy as a hegemon, as the kind of singular global power, especially since the end of the Cold War. There's been this unipolar world order since then, and there's a lot of talk in the right places, not in mainstream media, but if you listen to people who also are experts on these subjects, there's a lot of talk about a transition to a multipolar world where countries like China and Russia and India and Brazil and other like large countries with a lot of resources and land and high populations rise up to create other poles on the globe. And you have Pluto moving from Capricorn into Aquarius, Capricorn being the sign of business and tradition and hierarchy and structure. And, you know, if there were a sign to represent the colonial order, I think it would be Capricorn, into the sign of Aquarius, which is associated with rebelliousness and decentralization and non-hierarchy and networks. So that is another transition, kind of it's the lead up to Neptune moving into Aries. So those two transitions are happening like right now. And I think that, you know, that's kind of the prelude to the rest of this decade. Then in the medium term, the other big transits that I have looked at are the third Uranus return of the United States, and a trine between Pluto and Uranus, both like early in air signs, with Pluto in Aquarius and Uranus in Gemini. And I don't want to get too much into depth about these because I feel like it's a little much, and we've already dropped a lot of heavy stuff. But I think overall, looking towards the rest of the decade, yeah, the Death card is in there. I forget which other ones, but I think that
Hanged Man. There's
the
like,
Hanged Man,
you know, like this another liminal card.
right?
So like when I think of like a word to describe the medium term, it's protracted.
Can you define that for me?
Well, things being long and drawn out and not being super, the Death card is decisive, but it's like this protracted experience of destabilization.
Yeah.
Can't count on any kind of like, business as usual for any long-term
Yeah.
kind of prospect. We're a decade away from the time we can be like, and now things make sense and are proceeding in like this linear kind of way. And some things do get better and better, but there's this protracted period of destabilization.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's definitely there in the astrology, especially with Pluto in Aquarius and Uranus in Gemini. So there are these air signs where they can become very fragmented or decentralized or changing very quickly, changing on a dime, different changes happening all at once, all over the place. There's a lot of themes of technology with Uranus and with Gemini and with Aquarius. All of those archetypes relate to technology. So I think that hopefully there will be some positive developments. The trine between Uranus and Pluto, it also looks pretty scary to me in terms of Pluto being related to the like war machine and Uranus being related to technology. A trine is a harmonious angle, so I feel like that's kind of already happening. But with those two planets, once they're in air signs, things are going to move a lot more quickly. I think in the just coming together or working together of like those two parts of society. The third Uranus return of the United States has not a good track record. It was like 1944, 45 was the last one. And the one before that was 1861, I think, the Civil War. So like the other two Uranus returns of the United States, we've been at war in one way or the other. And so I guess I'll also say that like this has been my area of research is like looking into the astrology as it relates to the big political and climate and technological changes. And obviously that just is very collapse themed. Like that's really the overall direction that things have been going. So I really just haven't thought that much about on the personal level, like how we can activate the transits more specifically, right? To like work with them and channel that energy in a positive direction. And there definitely are a lot of very positive potentials, even if the overall trajectory of Western society especially is not positive for the next while. And so that air energy, especially, like that is an energy where things can change very quickly. And we haven't really had a lot of that going on. We haven't had outer planets and air signs for a while. So I think that could be a pretty different like background energy to be working with. And, just hopefully there are a lot of potentials that I don't see right now because I've had my head buried in the dark stuff.
Well, and I hope that all of the researchers and scientists who are working on solutions that may not be applied globally, but could be applied locally. So when you talk about like, oh, it's kind of fragmentary, it's kind of like, okay, well, if we're getting into air signs and things are happening really quickly, like for some people, that could be just what they need is we need some research to move forward very quickly. It could be vaccines, it could be technologies. It could even be like low tech, no tech, but like, oh, wow, this is a thing that we can do to solve this problem of infrastructure here or there. So there could be that like mobilization of small groups or like local pieces where actually it kind of works for you. And I will say like everybody's going to experience this differently, right? I'm not an astrologer. I just hang out with a lot of astrologers. So I do see how like sometimes something that's happening on the collective and I see it in my clients, it's like for me, I want to be quiet about it because I'm like, I'm kind of getting some good bounces here. This is actually working out like pretty well for me. And I see it with my husband too. Like he will describe how like right now, I think the phrase he used is like, I have multiple domains of overwhelm. That's his experience, like multiple domains of total overwhelm. But when he and I come together, something wild is happening where we're working on it and it's going really quickly and things are happening even better. And so there's something that's happening in our, what is it, like synastry or like something that happens. And I do think that this makes me think of like, yes, it could be fragmented, but it can also be that if you are playing well with your own astrology, then it kind of doesn't matter what's happening in the collective because you are where you're supposed to be in that moment. So maybe you will be able to be like, okay, here's the little faction of us that are all kind of like on a metaphorical desert island where this community, my street, the valley I live in, we all have this particular problem that's happening. And if we are like, yep, this is what's happening, we're not resisting the reality of it, when we all work together, there are these magical, very quick changes that can happen at different levels. So that's what I'm really hoping for and kind of looking forward to. Some of the hardest astrology in this year that I was telling everyone about, I was like creating additional services and stuff in the Numinous network to be like, okay, it's going to be really crunchy astrology. And while a bunch of people were experiencing that, some of us who like anticipated that and set up our lives to anticipate that actually was sort of a non-event, and we were able to hold space for other people. So this is why I think collapse astrology is actually really helpful, because I feel like people who say yes to the reality of their chart or yes to the reality of like what's happening in their lives or astrologically, it does just kind of go smoother for us. Do you get that?
Yeah. I've definitely had that experience where there's been really challenging astrology and I've known about it and I've done, what I do to like lean into it and work with it and change the way I'm operating to work with those energies and have it go well when it, seems to be just knocking a lot of people down. And yeah, for sure, like longer term, both with like kind of more immediate astrology, like when there's Mercury retrograde or whatever, but also with these longer term themes that are coming in. And what you said about like the local communities too is very Aquarian. Aquarius is all about those networks and groups and ways that we, the interdependence that we ultimately really need in order to survive. And Aquarius is also associated with like the electrical grid and cellular networks and these kind of things. And so Pluto in Aquarius could bring those things down in one way or another, not necessarily all at once, not necessarily all gone, but like we could experience life with less of that technological connection, which actually could drop us much more into operating interdependently, like inside of local communities, which I think is what Aquarius definitely will be wanting us to do during that whole 20-year transit.
I will be revisiting my business continuity plan. And so all of the guides in the network, there's whatever, a dozen of us, have access to this document, the business continuity document, that is just like a 2-pager Google Doc that has the chain of command. If I am unavailable, if Ruben's like, if we are going through something, and it's just like, it's almost like a will. It's like, this is what I wish to see happen. And everybody's kind of consented, but this way everybody knows what should happen if, there's a wildfire where I am and I can't teach and I can't get into my network or whatever. Other people have access to it and they know who steps into what role to keep the network going. And this is one of the reasons why I have guides in multiple, like, I think we have like 9 time zones or something like that. Like I cover almost the entire globe or whatever it is, or like not 9, it's like 5 time zones, but it's like, so there's somebody, if the whole West Coast is struggling, our entire management team isn't on the West Coast. It's like, there's people in Europe, there's people down in Mountain, there's people in Central, there's people in East, like it's, and so this is the working with the reality of, brownouts, blackouts, local internet goes down, that kind of stuff. Hermit would be a great year to just really think about how resilient is your business and your life if the internet is less reliable and way more expensive. And even cool things like what you just described. It's like, you can have like local internet. Like you don't have to have, a community can put up their own pole. And like, I know people where it's like one guy, it does the rural internet and he will hike up and like reconnect and stuff when it goes down. So these are the types of things that I think the cards and the astrology are telling us to get real creative and very real about. Is there anything more you wanted to highlight for us about upcoming transits?
I think we got the important themes out. I think, the Aquarian decentralization and dissolving of maybe a geopolitical world order, along with the climate crisis, are going to be the two prevailing themes.
That's pretty much it. Well, you
Yeah.
said something like you do what you do to like live in step with your chart. Tell us, like, what are you doing? How are you personally preparing, like spiritually or materially, for this period, which we started off by saying like it was for revolution and then it was for collapse, but we kind of want both. We're still going to be activist in our collapse. So let's call this revolutionary collapse. Like we're in collapse. But we are actively participating in it, and we are trying to orient towards and harvest the best parts of collapse for revolutionary purposes. So how are you preparing spiritually and materially for revolutionary collapse?
So I am not really prepared materially at all. I have barely tiptoed down that route, and I kind of want to normalize that for people. I'm coming out of a period in my life that was like a real bottoming out, and it was right there in my astrology. I'm a couple years out of the like deepest, darkest bottom of that, but that was also the time that I was like deeply starting to study, maybe not quite collapse frameworks yet, but starting to study just all the dark history of the West and ancient history or longo history and more recent history, and just starting to come to terms with a lot of the realities. And I spent a lot of time in a freeze response, which I do feel like I'm starting to emerge out of. But what I have been doing spiritually more than anything else is death practice. And so I work mostly with Pluto as my death deity of choice, but there are lots of other death deities that one could commune with. And I think that, so I want to normalize being in a place where like the old worldview is collapsing and you don't really know where you're going next, because I think that's happening to a lot of people right now. And I think I'm a couple of years ahead of a lot of the people that I'm talking to who in the past couple of years like have really started. And of course, the Gaza genocide, I think, has woken way more people up to the really scary realities of the police state and the war machine. And it's a lot to process. It's a lot of reality to take in. And then you mentioned a couple times, like letting go of the capitalist dreams, right? The things that we thought were like what our destiny looked like or what our soul really wanted, that were really just like programmed into us by capitalism. And so I think a lot of people are in that process right now, a very, very liminal process of the old stuff releasing, and not being in a place where you like know what to do yet or even how to prepare for collapse.
And so for me, like disillusionment in there too. So there's this emotional level of loss or betrayal, or some people feel cynicism. Like these are very valid, very legitimate, I think also very necessary processes to go through, even though they suck while they're happening, but they don't actually last forever.
Yeah. And for me, that is what death practice really, really helps with. And I don't have anything that's too active in terms of a ritual with death. It's mostly just sitting, or, sometimes it's bearing witness to what's happening in Gaza on my phone and just sitting with the horrific images and letting that come inside me. But a death deity is very important because the death deity helps you to compost the things that are not supporting you anymore. So in terms of even cynicism and disillusionment and like, those things are very valid and we need to just let them be there. But then there can also be a time when like, okay, I need to just death it. I like to use death as a verb, like just clear it out, have it be gone, so that then I can start to be present with my own reality and, this whatever new kind of frameworks I'm starting to integrate. So yeah, I think I feel pretty spiritually prepared for collapse, although I'm sure you can never be fully prepared, but I feel pretty spiritually prepared because I feel pretty tight with Pluto and some other deities too that just like help me be with the darkness. And so, yeah, if you're in a place where your worldview is coming down and you're like, I know I'm here for something, but I don't know what that is, that's okay to be in that place. Like you really don't have to, the death and the rebirth do not have to happen at the same time. And we don't have to immanentize the eschaton and be ready for collapse 100% tomorrow. So yeah, that's where I'm at with it right now. Although I do highly recommend Collapse 101 in the Numinous Network if you want to take some practical action towards educating yourself. And there's the one episode where you guys talk about like little practical steps you can take.
Totally. Well, and also I will say I have a number, a small number, but I have a few clients who are living through devastating man-made climate effects in Carolina, Tennessee, places like that. And, some of them were like real disciplined, keen students in Collapse 101. And we're like, oh my God, yes to everything that you said. And it was, and they've kind of give me the rundown of like, here's all the ways that was helpful for us. Here's all the ways that not only were we prepared, but we could help others. So everything that you said was true. And then there were some people who hadn't done any of the physical preps because just like you, it was just like, they were in the disillusionment of their own kind of personal collapse and took Collapse 101. I don't know. Sometimes that's just how you find yourself there and hadn't really done any of the preps. But what was so critical and what I was mirroring to them is, but they had the psychology of like, oh, this is collapse. Like, this is what's happening and this is what I need to do now. And so when I was doing kind of like emergency mental health sessions with them, all I had to do was affirm like, yes, you need to get out. Exactly. Yep. You are exactly the thing you're thinking is the thing you should do. And good for you for knowing deep down, like, I got to move right now. And so they had, you could maybe call it a psychological preparation or a spiritual preparation even, but they were able to listen and look around and know like, okay, this is the moment. And then they took action. And all I was there to do really was support them with like, yeah, that is the right action. You need to go, And so even if you don't do any physical preps, having reality-based conversations where you relinquish the kind of question mark of like, is this really happening right now? And you actually can be like, okay, I'm going to have a reality-based conversation, or I'm going to listen to this reality-based conversation about what's going on. And then I will spend less time frozen, questioning myself and feeling awkward, taking a step that I'm not seeing other people take yet. I will be the first one. So if you're listening, you haven't done any physical preps, potentially you would be interested in Collapse 101, not because you have the ability to do preps, but because it would feel good to have someone just tell you the truth and kind of have heard at least, here's what then we would do. And you can run with it,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Collapse 101, beyond just the physical, like prep suggestions or advice or whatever, you're taking action towards being collapse prepared by watching and just putting your mind, your consciousness into that framework and into that possibility. And I think that's fascinating with your clients and makes a lot of sense that like if you have done some of this processing ahead of time, when some kind of disaster strikes, there's just less layers to go through to like be in the reality and like be able to take the action that you need to do. And overall, like we can prepare as much as we want, and then who knows, right? So much, and you know, this is coming from me, like very unprepared in most of the physical ways, but like I do think that so much is just not visible right now, what we need to do, the steps we need to take. And I think that does relate to Neptune and Pisces. And hopefully in the next couple of years, there will be a lot more clarity on the individual level about like, okay, this is my role. Like, this is where I fit in. This is where I can serve.
Well, and I think of it as being mentally nimble. So this is kind of like a nice aspect of the Neptune Aries relationship, perhaps, is like taking action even while things are kind of like, whoa. If you've done the pre-work, like when one of these clients said, it was so good that my partner and I had conversations about things, so we didn't have to have that argument right while the emergency was bearing down on us. It's like we already, and so she said that freed our minds up for all the other decisions we had to make, since like in the same way that the astrology doesn't have the answers, Collapse 101 doesn't protect you from collapse events. Like they're going to be happening to you. And so you're trying to have figured stuff out beforehand. Okay, so I want to bring us back though to your practices spiritually, since like this is where you've been focusing. Can you tell us a bit about how you are either training for or currently in process or have recently been becoming more skillful with grief and rage?
I think I use the archetype of Chiron a lot to help me process big emotions. And there's nothing too specific that I can say about that. But I have a couple little physical things that evoke Chiron for me, and I hold them. And mostly with grief and rage, I just try to be present and try to breathe and try to be, in reverence to the human experience of the big things moving through. And I think with grief and rage, there can be a time for death practice, but it's not immediate. It's not, you don't want to compost those things until they're really ready to be composted.
Well, thank you so much for being in this brave conversation. And thank you so much for holding space for folks who are trying to make sense of what we're experiencing, like on a personal level, a global level, but particularly with climate, particularly with choices we need to make in collapse. It is very tip of the spear still, even though those of us who are in it, it's kind of like the water in which we swim, the air we're breathing. Like, this is not a topic. This is the way I live my life. So, it feels like okay to have these conversations, but there are a lot of listeners who are probably just going to come across you for the first time and be really relieved to know that you can help put them in perspective. So thank you so much for doing this work and shepherding us through these big transits, Hummingbird. I'm glad you were here today.
Thank you, Carmen.
I will put links to Hummingbird's work in the show notes. You should definitely get on our newsletter if you're interested in astrology and collapse, or just astrology too, but certainly if you're interested in astrology and collapse, it's a really fantastic newsletter. I find it highly enjoyable. And there'll be other links to some YouTubes and articles that are relevant to today's topic. Thank you, Hummingbird, for your excellent teaching today. Always look forward to your Instagram posts on these topics. And it's a brave thing to stick your head up and say, this is what I'm seeing. So I'm there with you. I'm tracking what you're tracking, and I'm glad all the listeners are here with us too.
Well, if you took all that in and you're still here, you're a rock star, and I am really, truly, genuinely glad that we're connected. So I just want to clarify a few things and maybe give a little more of a coherent summary of the upcoming astrology. First off, somehow in that whole conversation, I never got around to describing what exactly happens with Saturn and Neptune and Pisces and Aries. The transition from Pisces to Aries is very crucial. It's the last sign of the zodiac to the first one. So there's an element of rebirth, of new awareness, and then also Aries is about survival. The end of Pisces can be very delusional and disconnected from reality, and Aries is a wake-up call. So the reason 2025 is such a liminal year is because Neptune and Saturn both cross into Aries, both station retrograde at super, super early Aries, and both cross back into Pisces by the end of the year. And even though they come so close to one another, Saturn creeps up to within less than 1 degree of Neptune, they are never technically conjunct in 2025. That there's just one conjunction between those two planets, and it's in February of 2026 at 0 degrees of Aries. So that timing is wild, like kind of mind-blowing, how they both peak over that threshold into Aries, but then drop back in for one last swim in the Pisces Ocean before coming together fully at the 1st degree of the whole zodiac for, again, what I think will be a wake-up call for the whole planet about the immediacy of the climate crisis. The last Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn in 1989 aligned with the conception and construction of the World Wide Web and also the fall of the Berlin Wall. Saturn likes boundaries, but Neptune shatters or dissolves them. Meanwhile, Neptune tends toward delusion while Saturn forces a confrontation with reality. There will be other manifestations of the transit this time around, but I believe that the central theme will be a clear global climate emergency. But we won't get there, probably, in 2025. Next year, there will be some kind of alarm, but there probably won't be anything that feels like real progress. If there's hope during the middle of the year, like hope that humanity can take some drastic action to help itself survive, it will feel like a castle in the sand that gets washed away by a rising tide by the end of the year. At least that is what the astrology looks like. And I know this is painful and sad, so just take some deep breaths. Bring on your arms and legs, as Carmen says. Just try to stay mobile inside of that reality. Neptune and Pisces also bring in themes of grief, really deep grief. So I recommend that we use this time over the next year, this liminal period, to grieve enough to move past the denial and bargaining phases. If your future feels hazy, if your path feels uncertain right now, just let yourself grieve. Your role may be revealed when all the Neptunian fog clears. And that brings us to the next piece I want to touch on, which is a few other Hermity transits and themes for 2025. I've been doing 2025 year ahead readings for folks all month, and I have thought more about that, and there are just a couple of other things that I think everyone should know. One is the whole first 3.5 months of the year is nonstop interplanet retrogrades. We're actually already in this series of retrogrades now, with Mercury retrograde and Mars getting ready to station very soon on December 6th. And then Mars doesn't go direct until the end of February. And then immediately after, Venus stations retrograde. And then Mercury goes retrograde again. And it's not until mid-April that they're starting to move forward. And not really until May that any of those planets clear their shadows. So the whole beginning of the year truly is not a time to be pushing anything forward too much. Of course, we all have to get some things done in our lives, especially in a period of 3.5 months. But as much as you can at the beginning of the year, don't rush anything. Don't force things that aren't working. Listen if the universe is telling you to pull back from something to protect yourself, that something isn't aligning, that something feels off. Be ready to go into hermit mode, or, stay there. Like if you're already in hermit mode for the winter, just plan on staying there for the next several months. I also mentioned Uranus moving into Gemini, and that's another outer planet sign change that starts with a visit during 2025, but doesn't happen for good until 2026. And it's another reason why the year is liminal, transitional, not a year for fruition, as Carmen said, more like a year where we're getting little teases and peeks at what the future is bringing. But Uranus and Gemini, in general, those energies are pretty external and outgoing. And in that sense, it's kind of the opposite of the Hermit. Gemini is about communication and technology and creativity. Uranus is also about technology, and this transit will pretty much definitely bring new communication tech. It's very unpredictable energy, this kind of vibe where things come out of nowhere, but then integrate themselves seamlessly into the fabric of reality. Like, remember life before texting? So it may not be right away, but we'll almost definitely see some radical changes in our technology and the way that it fits into our daily life. There's also a really interesting correspondence between Uranus ingresses and the creation of new social media apps. So Uranus was entering Pisces in 2003, 2004 when Facebook came into being. It was moving into Aries in 2009 when Instagram was created, and it was entering Taurus in 2018 when TikTok launched. So if the trend continues, something that hasn't even been invented yet will sweep through over the next few years, and really maybe even literally next year. And who TF knows what that could be, especially with the rise of AI. So I think going back to the Hermit, take that advice and do not feel the need to follow the next trend, to become more extroverted than you really want to be, to surrender to whatever new direction our focus is being pulled, whatever new toy the billionaires are wanting us to play with. Don't feel like you need to follow that energy. I think the Hermit is a really good recommendation. And that takes me to the last thing I wanted to summarize, which is the themes of the next several years. The three big outer planet shifts, Pluto into Aquarius, Neptune into Aries, and Uranus into Gemini, they set the stage for the rest of the decade. And what I really get from the combination of all those archetypes is decentralization, fragmentation, fractalization, unpredictability, urgency from Neptune and Aries, but no unity, no social coherence, no shared traditions to lean into, and then just a lot of technology, probably a lot of surveillance and just more technology continuing to invade every aspect of our lives. It's really important to understand the geopolitical aspect of this. So if you haven't seen my analysis of Pluto and Aquarius and the multipolar world, I really recommend checking that out. I think the climate crisis will accelerate that process because even if it's affecting other world powers equally, America's already disintegrating political and physical infrastructure will make us much less likely to be able to respond effectively. And basically, this is bad news for us here in the West, but the transition to a multipolar world will be a good thing for the majority of the world's population, especially the global South. But I also wanted to emphasize the unpredictability of this energy. That piece came to my mind when I was re-listening to the podcast conversation, especially about the AMOC, that for as much information as we have, there's still a lot of unknown variables. I don't think it's unpredictable that the AMOC is shutting down, but how exactly it will play out, the pace, what exactly the effects will be in all the different parts of the world, how it will interact with the rest of the changes caused by global warming, how will other systems of ocean currents be affected. There's a lot we don't know, even if we can make educated guesses. And there is a high probability that we'll get some things wrong. The astrology just also affirms that. In terms of technology, both Aquarius and Gemini really refuse to be caged by authority. And so no matter how tight a grip the big corporations try to keep on developing tech, they won't be able to control everything. So we could see positive, unexpected technological breakthroughs, even if we're on an overall trajectory of collapse. Although I'm personally repulsed by the idea, I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more techniques like cloud seeding being used, large-scale tech projects aimed at manipulating the weather to counteract the effects of climate collapse. The US might fall behind in the development of this technology, but other countries like China, India, and Saudi Arabia are already investing heavily in weather manipulation. And while I don't think there's any way to slam on the brakes when it comes to the changing climate, humanity is at least going to try to adapt. And I bet we will see some powerful innovations come out of these transits, whether or not they ultimately save us, whatever that even means. Okay, so that about sums it up. Obviously, what I wanted to say was basically a whole other podcast, so I will just trust that everything fits together as it should. If you're still here, you are even more than a rock star. You're a real collapse comrade, so thank you, thank you. And if you're hungry for even more on the AMOC, here is Carmen with a deep dive.
So I want to take us into kind of like a little denouement, it's a part two, but it's like a part two to kind of wrap this up in a good way, hopefully. I'm going to expand a little bit on what we talked about with regard to the likelihood of the AMOC shutdown and the impacts of what that would be. So let's turn our attention to the body of work out in the world by Sharon Astic. Sharon Astic is the author of multiple books on collapse and the most like prolific writer on this topic you'll ever see. She has an excellent blog that I'll link to as well. I've asked her to come on the podcast, but it was in the middle of the pandemic, and those of us who are still COVIDing are like still in the pandemic. So but it'll come at some point. She and Ruben, my husband Ruben, tend to DM and message a bit more. Well, a lot more than she and I do. I'm just in Ruben's reflected glow kind of. But anyway, my point is she's in our orbit and has been for a long time. And just like a little tiny bit of her background that's relevant here is she's married to an astrophysicist who teaches environmental physics and teaches climate modeling to his students. And so I always imagine that their household is a little like mine and Ruben, where we're just like constantly in conversation about this stuff. We're just always kind of riffing on each other's last thought. We're engaged in this like never-ending volley of ideas that build on each other until one of you says to the other one, you should write a post about that. Or like we should offer a class on that. You should like do a podcast on that. But by the time you get to that point, you're so deep into this like mutual understanding that it's actually kind of hard to like back up and go far enough back to kind of go, okay, so we want to meet people where they're at, but where are they at? We don't know. We're like way off on our own track over here. So it's like hard to think about how do you bring people along to where the two of you are in your line of thinking. Anyway, this is totally just projection, but I presume it's like that for Sharon Astic and her partner. And so her husband's brilliant mind combined with the fact that she's a polymath, like she is one of those people who's basically a genius in multiple domains. I just think that means that she is a good source if you're looking for a really good meta-analysis of the scientific literature on pretty much any given like climate or collapse related issues. She's done a huge review, and if you follow her on Facebook, or I don't know if she's got a private situation now. I haven't been on Facebook in a long time, but prolific is an understatement. So I'm going to read some quotes, and we're going to hold each other's hand and go through this. We are standing together as thousands, and we can handle this. This is one of those oh shit things, but we can face anything together. So here's a quote from one of Sharon's numerous articles on the issue of the AMOC shutdown. Okay, actually, sorry. This is part of a series of essays, like long form blog posts, and I think it's like a 5 or 6 part blog series on her Ko-fi or Ko-fi. I don't know what that's called, but I'll link to it. And this is, if you really want to get into the AMOC, there's multiple blog posts that you could get through in an hour or two. Okay, here's the quote. Most of the media analysis will likely focus on how likely the AMOC shutdown is to happen. The paper claims that it is fairly certain, 95%, to happen between 2025 and 2095, with the most likely timing around 2057, end quote. So when we're going to talk about what the likelihood is of this happening, there's multiple papers that she's quoting in these blog posts. There was one that lots of people were talking about not too long ago in the journal Nature. But her quote, the point here is she's like, okay, people are saying they're 95% certain. When I say people, climate scientists are 95% certain that the AMOC shutdown is going to happen sometime between 2025 and 2095. But the likely timing is around 2057. However, as we come to see, she calls it Astic's law, but we can see this in a lot, just like really look around. Generally speaking, what climate scientists in the past would predict would happen after 2050, back in the day, they'd say, well, by 2050, we could see these kinds of changes in our climate. We're seeing that happen now. We're seeing that happen 30 years ahead of their predictions. And so it's not that much of a stretch then to say that what they predicted would happen before 2050 will happen maybe even a decade earlier than they said. So the possible range of hitting a tipping point to an AMOC shutdown was, predicted here as like maybe 2057. If we say, okay, but generally things are happening 30 years earlier, that's 2027. And so the things that we are happening, so the tipping point to shut down is like right around now. Astic goes on to say, quote, but even if the paper is partly wrong or even hugely wrong, even if there was only a 10% chance of that happening between those years and less than a 0.2% in any given year, and this is her emphasis, given the potential cost, it must be taken seriously, end quote. So she goes on to explain how risk analysis always depends on basically 3 different factors. And, I've talked about risk analysis in Collapse 101 quite a bit. But she, has it a simplified version. It's really good. So the first factor is how likely is the thing? If we're trying to analyze the risk in order to determine how many resources we're going to devote. And when I say resources, it's not just money or time. It's our cognitive resources. How much are we going to think about this and consider this? That this is an important factor that we need to measure. So the first thing people will say is, okay, well, how likely is this thing? And this is why she's saying this is what the media is going to focus on, as though that's the determining factor we should judge risk. But it's not. It's really, really not the main factor. That's just one factor. And if you ask me, I think the likelihood is a more minor factor compared to the others. Because if something has a truly catastrophic impact, then we will want to make different choices, even if there's a smaller chance of it happening. So this brings us to the second one. We have to consider the second factor, which is how much will this hurt? How severe will the outcome be? What is the catastrophic impact rating on a scale of 1 to 10? So this is an absolutely crucial thing to weigh in risk analysis. So, for example, most of us are not going to perish in a house fire. Most of us are probably not even going to ever call the fire department in our entire lives. But if we did have an accident with a house fire and it left us or our family members dead or destitute, that is a worst case scenario. So that's why we get life insurance and fire insurance and install smoke alarms and sprinklers. We do all kinds of things to give advance warning and we do things to try to mitigate by like having fire codes and stuff. So considering the actual likelihood of it happening, maybe we're going overboard on precautions and insurance, but given how utterly devastating that result would be, we consider those precautions quite commonplace. In many cases, they're required by law. They're definitely required by building codes and insurance companies, right? So same thing here. Then the third factor Sharon invites us to consider is this. What is the utility of our knowledge? And then what are the costs and benefits that knowing this thing brings to us? So what that means is like, if we know this is a possibility that is likely, it's 95% going to happen. And for many of us within our lifetimes, but most definitely within the lifetimes of young people, children today, then what are the benefits to that knowledge? Well, the benefit is taking that knowledge seriously so we can plan for it and maybe mediate some of the worst effects, making decisions now. And some of us are still pressing really hard on policy about this. Others of us are like relocating, So the utility of the knowledge is forewarned is forearmed. She sums this all up nicely with something that we've all had personal experience with already, to just like as a way to put in perspective the utility that this knowledge could have. So Astic writes, we've seen that in real life with COVID. We all know that COVID entirely could have been stopped, and without any different measures than were applied in March of 2020. We just would have had to apply them universally in late January of 2020, not March. The same shutdowns we did anyway, if we had just done earlier, would have been effective. Close the flights, send everyone home, subsidize staying home, and 6 or 8 weeks later, no COVID. Maybe never even COVID ever again, like SARS-1. We absolutely could have done it. But the economic and social and most of all political costs were too high, so we didn't, so we have what we've got. We chose not to know about COVID because we didn't want to deal with the costs of knowledge. Remember how no one would get tested for the first few months, even when they had symptoms and exposure? And now again, we choose not to know about COVID. No testing, no data collection. We would also prefer not to know about the worst case scenarios of climate change, or not think about them outside the context of slightly comical disaster movies. I have absolutely no doubt that our government and most governments will do absolutely as much as possible to cast doubt on the possibility that we could cross this particular tipping point. But the good thing about this paper is that it has made it impossible to entirely do so. Still, the kinds of mitigations necessary to make this work are huge, so expensive, and so disruptive to regular life. I have no doubt we will devote most of our energy and resources to making sure they don't happen. But contrarily, for most of us, our lives and the lives of our posterity, and we all have posterity, whether it's biological or collective, they depend on us taking this very, very seriously, and always have. And we all know our governments will be happy to let millions of us die. 20 million people or more have died already of COVID. This is just practice in normalizing mass death from climate change over the next decades. But the only way that major structural change will occur is if people demand it or make it. The correct question to answer is not, does everyone 100% agree that this is going to happen? But rather, what are the consequences if we don't prepare? And this does happen. End quote. I just want to send gratitude and a bubble of protection to Sharon Astic, who has been a Cassandra for so many years, but especially now. And I hear you. I am listening. And all of us who are just trying to digest this now, I am with you. I am also just utterly overwhelmed by this. We probably don't have to do too much different than we're already doing, but what I would say is think about how you procure your food, whether you grow it, whether you glean it, whether you trade for it, what you trade. Most of us trade cash dollars. Are there other things you can trade? Do you have skills? Can you babysit? Or, somebody who needs to be gardening, that kind of thing. What can you do? Because if there are major agricultural, like climate changes that impact agriculture, and that happens in the next 10 years, and it would be good. Every little thing that you can grow for yourself matters. If you think about that, let's say you want to try to grow great tomatoes or lots of potatoes. 10 years is only 10 tries. And I don't know about you, but there's not many things I've only done 10 times that I've been really great at. So now is a good time. Now is a great time to just practice. Where would you get food if supply chains were disrupted, if you couldn't eat what you normally eat, if you needed to trade for it? Now is a great time to start practicing. So we don't have to do too much too different, but we have to get a little more serious about the things we've been kind of casually thinking about doing to prepare for climate changes. Okay. There's been a lot to chew on in this episode. If you want to leave me feedback, if you want to commiserate, if you just need a place to vent, you can go to the show notes or to numinouspodcast.com, like in your player or on my website, and you will find a link to leave feedback. You can either leave a voicemail or a written note. I am happy to hear from you. I'm wide open. Drop me a line. Commiseration always feels good on my end. Or you can open up a new browser tab and go to castfeedback.com/Numinous Podcast and do it there. My listener shout out today is to Maggie from Mexico, who left me some feedback. Thank you, Maggie. Maggie said, I adore your podcast. It's so regulating, so informative, so organizing, a true beacon of light in a world that often feels like a hellscape. Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. It sounds like you've listened to my collapse episodes, and there is a contingent, people like me, people like us who find it very organizing, and coherence is very grounding. And so when somebody just speaks truth and tells you, hey, this is what's really going on, this is the reality, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's super sucky and shitty and overwhelming, but we're going to face it together and be very honest. I mean, that there's something inherently settling in that for me. So thank you for listening. Thanks for being here. And if you'd like to join us for Collapse 101, more folks doing this kind of thing. And because Collapse 101 isn't a podcast, we're like together in class. I do a lot more kind of somatic pauses and like lots of somatic resets, and there's like more opportunity to like verbalize and stuff. It's probably easier to digest than a podcast episode. Anyway, if you want to join us in Collapse 101, you just register for the Numinous Network. Once you get in the network, you'll find an on-demand video course with topics that start with foundational frameworks for collapsing in place, processing big emotions around collapse, to some very specific explainers on topics like the rise of fascism in collapse and long COVID in collapse. I've received feedback recently from folks who are in North Carolina who experienced devastating impacts from Hurricane Helene, who had done Collapse 101, and they reached out to me to say, thank goodness we had done that, or like it was so helpful. And their ability to stay kind of upright and mobilized and just instinctively know what to do, it was very gratifying to hear that. So it was really great to have people thank us, Ruben and I, for creating Collapse 101. And it was very gratifying to know that it actually had really helped. So maybe even more important than the information itself is you'll find people who are tracking the same things you are, and you'll learn how they're managing, and we all keep each other upright and mobilized, right? You'll see how they're making tiny choices, tiny steps, even though they also have a sensitive nervous system, even though they also are recovering from personal trauma, even though they also are just trying to survive capitalism, just like all of us, Everyone in the Numinous Network is somebody with a sensitive nervous system or who is surviving a big thing. But we also are linking up and facing realities together. And maybe that's like the most valuable, priceless thing. Every month or two, we get together for a collapse AMA, Ask Me Anything, or for a witnessing circle, pretty basic prompt. How's your collapse going? We just do a lot of like normalizing, stabilizing activities, especially if the people in your life kind of have their heads in the sand about this. Please don't underestimate how much better you're going to feel when you are around people who are tracking what you're tracking. And all of this is included with your Numinous Network membership. You can find out more at carmenspagnola.com, CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.